Hello everybody, and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Liz Moody. I'm the host of the Liz Moody podcast. I'm so excited to be here tonight. Just a few quick reminders before we get started. Tonight's program is being recorded, so we kindly ask that you silence all of your cell phones for the duration of the program. If you could take a second really quick, just check. Sometimes we think it's silent. It is not. If you have any questions for our wonderful guest speaker tonight, there are cards on your seats, or you can submit those in the YouTube comments. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the great, the wonderful Simone Stolzoff. Hello. Simone is an author and a journalist who writes about the intersection of work, identity, and meaning. He is a former IDEO design lead and the author of the brilliant new book, How to Not Know: The Value of Uncertainty in a World That Demands Answers. Simone, I'm curious, was there an experience with uncertainty in your past that you had that sparked you writing this book?
No, I've never thought about uncertainty once. I mean, the cliche among authors is that you write the book that you need to read. And so there's sort of like a professional answer that I sometimes give about, like, my first book was about work and identity, and so many people would reach out about questions of their own careers and what the future of work looks like. But the real answer is, before all of this, before I'd written a book, I had this career uncertainty question for myself. And I'm smiling because, I'm from San Francisco, and so this is like a home game for me. Some of you were part of this moment of tumult for me, where I was working for this trendy magazine in New York, and I got a job offer to join this design firm here in San Francisco, and I could not make up my mind for the life of me. And I was insufferable. I talked to probably half a dozen people that are here about the problem. I talked to my yoga teacher. I talked to my Uber driver about it. And I think ultimately there were two insights. One was, part of the problem was that my work and my identity had become so entwined. I'd become enmeshed with my career, and that really became my first book. And then the second insight was that I was looking for certainty where there was no certainty to be found. And so I thought that if I just sort of banged my head against the wall at the right angle, I would know which was the perfect job to take. And now, with the benefit of hindsight and some years, I understand that maybe uncertainty isn't always a problem to be solved, and we have to be able to make decisions and commit in spite of the uncertainty that we feel.
If we're on the receiving end of somebody like that, where they're like, oh my gosh, you're like, I've had this conversation with you 11 times at this point, is there something that we can say that would be perhaps more helpful?
I think there's a lot of different strategies. One that I like is say, you should definitely choose path A.
Oh,
and that becomes like a coin flip. You either say, oh, really? Say more. Or, no, I don't want to do that. And then they can use that reaction to be a little informative of what path they might want to take moving forward.
You said there's a couple. Give us one more.
There's a psychologist that I spoke to for the book named Michael Dugas. And he was the first person to link our intolerance for uncertainty with a lot of mental health problems and anxieties today. And he said when people are particularly aversion, they have sort of an intolerance for uncertainty, he sees two main behaviors. The first is that people become very impulsive, where they'll just make a choice quickly to avoid having to sort of sit with what they don't know. And the second is people become obsessive information gatherers. And you probably know which one you are. You're either the person that has to read 20 different Amazon reviews before they buy a plastic water bottle, or the person that just sort of buys the first one they see in the store. And I think both are a symptom of this deeper problem of our unwillingness to be okay with not knowing. And so I think there is sort of a middle path. Maybe you read 3 reviews and then pick your favorite one. But either extreme is often just a result of the same underlying discomfort.
I swing dramatically between the two. So I'll do like 30 reviews, and then the next day I'll go and spend a bunch of money without thinking about it at all, which I imagine is not the ideal.
Well, to each their own.
I do like this about you. You're like, I'm going to give you all the information, and then you go live your life.
I mean, that's one of the nice things about being a journalist. I don't have to be the expert myself. I can go out and talk to a philosopher and a psychologist and an economist, and then triangulate the truth from them.
Yeah, you tell so many fascinating stories in this book. It's been out for a few days now. Are there any that you feel like are really resonating with people who are reading it?
I opened the book with maybe my favorite story in the book, which is a couple, and they have been together for 17 years, married for 10, and they're out having a drink at a bar in Manhattan. And they're talking about their relationship. They both feel that something isn't quite right, but they're not sure exactly what to do. And then they decide to do something that other people might see as insane. They decide to go their separate ways for a year and then vow to come back to the exact same bar to determine their fate. And they called it the year of living dangerously. And I like sort of asking people on the street, doing sort of informal polls, like, do you think they stayed together or do you think they broke up? Because I think it says a lot about the question.
Should we do a poll?
Sure, yeah, let's do a show of hands.
If you think they stayed together, raise your hands. Okay, and if you think they broke up? All right, we have some love people. I feel like more voting in favor of
the
love.
Pina Colada song people and the pessimists, you know. And as much as I'd like to tell you the answer, this is my cliffhanger, so you have to buy the book to find out.
But he does clearly say it. Like, there's no, like, will they, won't they? It is very clearly said in the book.
Yeah.
You write in the book that our tolerance for uncertainty is actually decreasing in this present moment. Why is that?
There are two things going on. The first is the felt experience of uncertainty is on the top of so many people's minds. I think it's no secret to know that in the last 5 years, there have been some of the highest measurements of uncertainty since academics started measuring the phenomenon. So between the pandemic and wars overseas, tariff policies, job market tightening, the world is incredibly uncertain. But the less talked about phenomenon is that our tolerance for uncertainty is in decline, as you said. And there's this researcher from the University of Virginia named Nicholas Carlton who has done some fascinating studies on the link between smartphones and the rise of our intolerance for uncertainty. And he's found that they're directly correlated. And so a few potential explanations. One, phones create the expectation that answers should be readily available. So whereas maybe 10 years ago, I might have been okay not knowing the name of a given actor, now I feel an almost involuntary need to like reach into my pocket right away, maybe while the movie is still going. And the second thing that phones do is they rob us of the practice of sitting with what we don't know. They take all of the uncertainties of the world, whether it's a crisis happening overseas or the real-time location of our kids running around, and they bring them to our pockets. But access to this limitless information has not necessarily made us any wiser. And in fact, it often just fuels our anxiety. And so the world is incredibly uncertain. Our tolerance for uncertainty is in decline. And that's why so many people, in my opinion, feel anxious and unmoored right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. And one of the things that you're asserting in your book is that uncertainty tolerance is essentially a skill, and we can build that skill. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's not fixed. You know, uncertainty tolerance is not like your height or your eye color. We have an ability to train it over time. So one sort of analogy that I like is there's a study in Germany about athletes. And what they found is athletes and non-athletes have the same pain threshold, so like the moment in which they start experiencing pain. But athletes tend to have a lot higher pain tolerance, which means they can endure that pain for a little bit longer. And I think the truth can be paralleled to our relationship with uncertainty, where you might feel like you are more uncertain, and certain people will try and opt out of that uncertainty as quickly as possible, try to find the safe way out or the quickest way out. Whereas others might be more comfortable not knowing and staying in that not knowing state until they find the sort of possibilities waiting on the other side.
Yeah, it's interesting because you also don't want to tip too far there. I have friends where they will be so comfortable in that not knowing state that they'll essentially never make a decision. You know, it is about that happy medium space.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I relate to this personally. I think when you're in a state of indecision or you're ruminating, it's sort of the devil you know. There's a certain comfort in that low-grade suffering of not being able to make a decision, because the moment you make a decision, then you have to deal with the ramifications. I like to think about the moment before you make a decision, all the options are still on the table. And then the moment after you make a decision, you foreclose on all that optionality in order to see what the decision you make will show you. But in that immediate aftermath, it can feel like grief. It can feel like a loss because you no longer get to walk on all those other paths and you haven't yet found out the benefits of the path that you chose.
How do you make decisions differently after writing this book?
There's a few different heuristics that I learned from experts that have stuck with me. So for example, I spoke to this philosopher named Ruth Chang, and she says the reason a hard decision is hard is because one option is not necessarily better than the other. One option is better for some reasons, the other option is better for other reasons, and neither is better overall. If that weren't the case, it would be an easy decision. And so what she recommends is you make a decision relatively quickly, and then you spend the energy that you would have spent agonizing over the decision retroactively telling yourself why you made the right decision. You can become the author of your own narrative and say, oh, I chose this for that reason. So say you're choosing what to eat for breakfast, and you're choosing between a bowl of yogurt and a donut. The yogurt is more healthy, the donut is more delicious, but neither option is better overall. She says, make a choice. Today I choose the donut, and then tell yourself the reasons why you made that choice. Donuts are delicious, I want to start my day with joy. And then you can sit with the decision that you made, as opposed to constantly weighing those pro and con lists. There are other sort of people from different disciplines that had different approaches to these sort of uncertain decisions. One I liked was an ethicist I spoke to named Ira Bredsow. And he is both an ethicist in a hospital and a career counselor for college students. And what he says is when he interviews college students about their prospects, he always asks them the same 3 questions. The first question is, what do you want? And the idea there is to get out of your head and into a more embodied experience of what does your gut tell you. The second question is, do you want that? And it's a little heady, but it's to tap into what he calls your second order desires, your sort of more reflective state. So do I want a cigarette? Sure. Do I want a cigarette? Maybe not. And then the third question is, what does that choice say about the person you are? And that's what I think is the most important of the 3 questions, because it ties your decision-making to your values, to your aspirational self. And in the moment that you're making a decision, you can't necessarily control the outcome of that decision. But if you make a decision that's sort of aligned with your values and aligned with the person that you want to be, hopefully you can stand by that decision, even if you don't get the outcome that you desire.
So have you found decision-making easier since you've been employing these tactics?
Yeah, yes and no. I wrote this book because I'm not a very good decision maker. I love to waffle. I love to play my own devil's advocate. I love to procrastinate for as long as possible before making a decision. But there are some tools, heuristics that have helped me speed up. So another one that we haven't talked about is the difference between one-way door and two-way door decisions. This is a framework that's often attributed to Jeff Bezos, but one-way door decisions are the decisions that are hard to reverse. So who should I marry? Should I buy this house? And they deserve a more analytical, deliberative thought process. Whereas two-way door decisions are a little bit easier to reverse and therefore can be made a little bit more quickly. The problem is we often make two-way door decisions with the analytical framework of a one-way door decision and discount our own ability to course correct or walk back to that door and adapt.
We've been talking a lot about how to deal with the negative ramifications of uncertainty, but you also talk about how there's upsides to uncertainty. What are some of the benefits of uncertainty?
The main one in my mind is that when we are certain, specifically about something that hasn't happened yet, it has a narrowing effect. It closes our minds. Whereas if we can stay in that sort of not knowing state, if we can stay open to the possibilities that may emerge, we can see many more options unfold in front of us. So think about a really genre-busting artist, for example, or a scientist who's looking to make a breakthrough, or an entrepreneur who wants to start a really generational, original company. These are all people who get to the precipice of what they don't know and are willing to persist. They're willing to discover the possibilities that sit on the other side of their discomfort. But if we're too quick to reach for certainty, that's when you start to create derivative art. You go towards something that you've seen before, or maybe something that you've done before. That's when you start to preclude yourself from taking that risk that might ultimately show you something that's better than anything you could have imagined before.
How do we know if we're in a situation that could use more certainty versus a situation that could use more uncertainty?
I think they're both integral parts of being a human being. Even though I wrote this book about not knowing, I don't think the full uncertainty side of the spectrum is a healthy place to be either. I like this idea that comes from Aristotle, and he talks about virtues as being the mean between two extremes. And so if you think about extremes being something like complacency on one side and like chaos or entropy on the other side, You don't necessarily need to know exactly where you want to be on that spectrum, but you can probably sense whether you're too far on one side or the other. If your life is feeling like it doesn't have much exploration, like you are having a lot of rinse and repeat days, then maybe you need to sort of nudge yourself towards a little bit more novelty or uncertainty. Whereas if you feel like there aren't sort of anchors, there aren't things that are holding you down and making you feel safe and secure, then maybe you should nudge yourself a little bit toward the certainty side of the spectrum. I think the problems exist at the extremes, but we need both in our lives, and having certainty about some aspects of our lives makes it easier to hold uncertainty in others.
I love always in these types of talks to give a little sneak peek behind the curtain. And we were talking a little bit in the green room about how you've almost approached the launch of this book with this mix of uncertainty and certainty. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think putting a book out into the world can be the source of lots of anxiety and worry. And it can also be this incredible accomplishment. And when you have like a very specific goal, like reaching the New York Times bestseller list or making partner at your firm, it can really take you out of the present moment. Like I found myself, I was flying from DC this morning and I was listening to this book, Strangers, that you may have heard of, this like very popular nonfiction book. And it's about this woman, Belle Burden, who basically her marriage fell apart, and it's a memoir about her putting the pieces back together. And it's been this sort of mega hit. And I found myself thinking, man, I wish I was Belle Burden. I could have a New York Times bestselling book. But in actuality, like the means that were required to get to that end were not a life that I wanted to live. And I think it's easy to grasp for that certainty, to sort of compare your insides to other people's outsides. But when I sort of detach myself from the outcome-based goal, I can be a little bit more in the moment and enjoy the process as I go.
And I also love talking to you about, like, you have put so much into this, you've done so much. And I do think there's a power in saying, like, I have done what is in my control and I am recognizing what's outside of my control. And I think the more, I've certainly embodied that more since I've read your book. And I think the more we can all embody that, it allows more of a sense of inner peace.
Yeah, definitely, both on sort of the personal and in the macro sense too. So, for example, there's a chapter about climate change where I went to this country in the Pacific called Tuvalu, where the average height of the entire country is about 9 feet above sea level. And so the forecasts are that within the next, before 2050, half of the country will be underwater. And so it's this fascinating case study about what do you do when there's this sort of looming cloud on the horizon. And I talked to a bunch of climate therapists, so people who specialize in anxiety about climate change. And one of them said something that really stuck with me, which is the same thing that will help manage your anxiety is the thing that can help address the climate crisis, which is looking at the sort of tapestry of different problems and then taking one little thread and pulling on it, finding a sense of agency, being able to be part of the solution. Both will help absorb some of your anxiety and it'll help make a difference. And I think one of the big costs of our intolerance of uncertainty is that it can be paralyzing. I really like this definition of uncertainty as a sense of doubt that keeps you from making progress. And so when we're able to become more comfortable with that which we don't know, we can make choices. We can take steps in spite of not being sure exactly how they might turn out.
And if you want, I think Katie's here tonight, so if you want your third book to mirror strangers more, we can talk to her about leaving you, taking Luca, giving you some good meaty material.
Yeah, we'll take that offline. Katie is my wife, for those of you who don't know.
At work, what's the best way to negotiate how much uncertainty we should be projecting at any moment and how much uncertainty we should be projecting at any moment, both as an employee and also as a boss?
It's a balancing act. I think the common assumption is that people who speak with the most conviction are the most trustworthy. But the research doesn't necessarily bear this out. So in the book, for example, I break it down into these 3 parts, these 3 chapters. And the second part is about hubris and our sort of excessive pride that keeps us from admitting what we don't know. And so I think the best leaders in a work context aren't necessarily know-it-alls. They aren't people that say, this is exactly how many jobs AI will take in the next 13 years. They're people who are sure about what they know and also willing to admit what they don't know. They have enough humility to be able to say, I'm not sure, or I got this wrong. And I think that is a sort of model of leadership that really resonates with us as individuals, the people who are willing to trade some of that hubris for more intellectual honesty and humility.
And what about as an employee?
As an employee, I think it's also sort of a balancing act. I'm really inspired by employees who are willing to prototype and run experiments. So I used to work at this design firm, IDEO, and we used to have this saying, which is never come to a meeting without a prototype. And then as employees or teams, we often get caught in these loops where we're just thinking about planning and talking about what we might build. But one piece of advice, just 2 days ago, I was at the University of Vermont, and they were talking to me about sort of how do you be an effective early career employee. And one thing that I said is try to come to your boss with ideas for answers, but holding them lightly. So saying, this is what I propose we should do. This is why I think we should do it. This is sort of the data that backs it up. And this is an experiment that we can run and learn if it's actually working, rather than sort of like marching in and saying, this is the one way that we must do things, or being too fixed to a strategic plan or a 5-year idea of what your career looks like. You can treat it more experimentally and be willing to run the experiment.
Zooming out on career, what would you say to somebody who's looking down the pipeline of their career and they're uncertain about what they should be doing, what way things are going? How would you advise they think about this moment in time?
So you mean like all of us? Yeah. I think, so you said something earlier that stuck with me, which is separating what you can and what you can't control. I often think about the serenity prayer. You might be familiar with this. It's the idea that, God, give me the serenity to understand the things that I can control, the courage to understand the things that I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. And so if you're early in your career and you're at a point where you are unsure of what is to come, maybe the first step is to try and find a sense of ownership over a project that doesn't require anyone else to give you permission. So finding something where sending out resumes or trying to apply to these jobs online might seem futile, but pairing that effort where you're sort of increasing your surface area for luck to hit you with a sense of agency over things that you can build and that you can show for. I spoke to this psychologist named Kate Sweeney, and she studies what's called acute uncertainty, so uncertainty that will be resolved. And she told me about this sort of decision tree that she thinks about. And the first question is, can you control the outcome? So imagine you are a senior in high school and you're worried about what college you will ultimately go to. If you're at a point before you've submitted your application, you can do things that control the outcome. You can try to write the best essay as possible. You can try and get good grades. But once you've submitted your application, you've done what you can to control the outcome, you sort of go down the decision tree. And the next question is, can you prepare for multiple potential contingencies? So I think one trap we fall into is getting too fixed on one vision of the future. And then it becomes fragile. If you don't get that thing that you want, it can feel existential. So rather than just planning for one potential path, maybe planning for multiple paths. Apply to a safety school. And then once you've done what you can to prepare for multiple potential outcomes, it just comes down to regulating your nervous system, being okay with the waiting. And this can be extremely hard. One study that Kate conducted was for breast cancer patients. And she found that the period between getting a biopsy and getting a diagnosis is often the hardest part of women's entire breast cancer journeys. More so than chemo or surgery, it's the waiting, it's the not knowing. In another study, there was 2 research groups, and one group was given a 50% chance of receiving a painful electric shock, and the other group was given an 100% chance of receiving a painful electric shock. And the group with the 50% chance were far more anxious and stressed than the 100% chance. We would rather know that a bad thing is going to happen than have to grapple with the ambiguity of not being sure. And so when you're in that place where you've done what you can to control the outcome, you've prepared for multiple potential scenarios, then it just comes back to what can you do to calm your nervous system, stay grounded, and be able to make the weight a little bit more bearable.
What can you do as somebody who struggles with that?
There's a few different tactics. One is things that are about regulating your nervous system from a biological level. So there's been some studies on things like breath work and yoga that can help literally ground us when we're in this anxious place of not knowing. There are things that we can do to distract ourselves. So I think COVID was a great example of this. In one study that I'll call out, they were giving students the results of a test, and they had to wait before they received the results. And while they were waiting, the researchers broke them down into 3 groups, and they gave one group a game of Tetris that was way too hard. And they gave another group a game of Tetris that was way too easy. And they gave a third group a game of Tetris that was sort of at their threshold for challenge. And the first and the second group both really struggled with the waiting. But the third group was able to find a sense of flow, and that actually made the waiting period more tolerable. And so if you're sitting in quarantine in, say, April of 2020, and you're just sort of white-knuckle gripping, waiting for this period to end, you're going to suffer. But if you can find things that allow you to get out of that sort of future worry and into the present moment and immerse yourself in what you're doing, the waiting period might get a little easier.
Where does a bottle of whiskey fall on that spectrum?
The flow of the whiskey.
What do you rely on? What are your practices when you're in these moments of uncertainty in your life?
Well, I used to be someone who, as you might imagine, was like an obsessive information gatherer. I would talk to everyone about it. I would really try and look for answers out into the world. And I think one thing I've tried to do a little bit more is quiet myself down and try and trust my inner compass. There's a psychologist who I quote in the book named Rollo May, and he says that commitment is healthiest not in the absence of doubt, but in spite of doubt. And I love this idea that making decisions in spite of doubt, in spite of not knowing how they're going to turn out, empowers us to refine our character. It empowers us to live by our values. And so that's what I've been trying to do in sort of these smaller decisions in my own life, like what should I do for work, or how should I think about the future that my son is going to inherit, trying to really lead with values so that I can stand by decisions regardless of how they might turn out.
So almost knowing your values in some ways serves as a nervous system regulator.
Yeah, so for example, in the couple that was deciding whether or not to break up or stay together, I got to interview John Gottman, who some of you might be familiar with at the Love Lab at the University of Washington. And his big sort of insight was that in these moments of, indecision in a relationship, you have to know thyself. And if you know thyself, you'll be willing to withstand, or at least better withstand, the slings and arrows that are inevitable in a life up and down, either single or with a partner. But if you don't know yourself and you're just sort of letting the world tell you what you want, then it's like not having firm ground to stand on. You're very susceptible to be blown in one direction or another.
Okay, well, that begs the question, how does one get to know oneself?
One thing that I like doing is thinking about past narrative moments in my life that were really impactful. So from a career perspective, thinking about a moment in my career, maybe not the shiniest moment, like getting a promotion or updating my LinkedIn, but a moment where I felt like I was really doing the work that I wanted to be doing, and then breaking it down, treating it sort of like a scientist and trying to take out the values or understand the reasons why I like doing that thing as a way to become more conscious of what was working. So I think about this analogy when I was in journalism school. They used to make us read The New Yorker and write the sort of tactics that the journalist was using in the margin. And I think we can all do that in our lives a little bit. If there's moments that we know are going really well, or moments that we know aren't going very well, asking ourselves why, asking ourselves what is the sort of higher level learning that we can take from this really rich soil in our lives.
So we talked about career. I'd love to talk about relationships a little bit. Does how we sit in uncertainty, how we make decisions, does that differ if we're talking about, say, a romantic relationship? Is this my person? Should we break up? How do I know if I'll find my person?
Yeah, I think it comes back to this idea of separating what you can and you can't control. So I think we probably both have friends who are maybe in their late 30s or early 40s and don't yet have a partner, but really want to have a family. And I think we need to do two things in those types of situations. You need to cultivate a sense of faith. I think faith can be a really practical skill, not necessarily in a religious context, but in the sense of putting your heart on something, making a bet, having belief in your future self. And you also need to be able to do some of that contingency planning so that it's not just about sort of the power of attraction or manifestation to get what you want. You're actually taking actions that can get you closer to your ultimate goal and weighing the trade-offs. It's all about trade-offs. One of the most popular New York Times op-eds of all time was called "Why You'll Marry the Wrong Person." And it was by Alain de Botton, the philosopher. And he essentially argued that when we think about a potential suitor or a potential spouse, we think about their best qualities. We romanticize them. We sort of project this ideal. But maybe a better question is, what kind of crazy are you willing to put up with? Or maybe, what kind of crazy are you? And by understanding both the sort of shadow and the light of a person, you can have a more accurate view of what it means to interact with a complex, multidimensional human being.
What kind of crazy are you?
I am like a shiny object syndrome guy. I get like really distracted. I am like always looking for the next new thing, and it's hard for me to really be present and sort of settle in. And one of the things that I really value about Katie, my partner, is that she's like the most present person I've ever met. Like she's never distracted. And I think those opposites really attract.
It's great advice. Like, can my worst parts meet and match with this person's worst parts versus my best? We should start a dating app.
There we go.
Where you lead with all of your least your worst qualities.
That'll be our icebreaker question at the next time.
Why shouldn't I date you?
How are you crazy?
Yes. Has writing this book changed the way that you approach any part of your personal life relationships, your romantic ones, your friendships, or your fatherhood?
Yeah, I mean, many of them. There's an anecdote that I tell at the end of the book from a friend of mine named Emily, who's actually from San Francisco as well. And she is a therapist. She's sort of like a therapist to the stars. She advises CEOs and entrepreneurs who are going through change and helping them navigate uncertainty. But before she became this mental health professional in her early 20s, her mom was given this potentially terminal diagnosis. And so for weeks, Emily had to sit by her mom's side in the hospital and was really struggling. She was riding this roller coaster of anticipatory grief and fear. And one day, this family friend of hers named Bill came to visit her. And Bill is an oncology doctor, so he has lots of experience dealing with people at the end of their lives. And he said something to her that I think is so profound and wise. He said, "Emily, the version of yourself that will deal with that tragedy, if or when it happens, will be born into existence in that moment. And that version of you will have more context, more information, and be better equipped to deal with it than you are today. You have to trust in your future self's ability to handle future problems." And I think that just nugget of wisdom has really stuck with me as I think about the anxieties that consume me right now. So, what type of world will my son grow up into? Can I continue to make enough money to afford to live in the city that I love? But part of cultivating faith is this idea of trusting in your future self. And I think it does two things. One is it re-grounds you in the present moment when you're worrying about something that hasn't happened yet. It's sort of taking you out of the realm of your influence, the moment that we're in. And two, you don't rush out to meet your suffering. And in Emily's case, her mom ended up recovering and made it out of the hospital. And I think she's so glad that she got that piece of advice from Bill because she didn't have to unnecessarily suffer about something that never came to be.
That's so beautiful. I know we talked about AI a little bit earlier, but we are in San Francisco. My husband and I tried to...
We made it 29 minutes.
No, we already talked about it. My husband and I tried to find one non-AI billboard on our drive here, and we could not find one. I think it's very pressing on people's mind right now, and the uncertainty of the AI situation. Is this going to take people's jobs? What's the length of time we're looking at? How should we be preparing? What should we not be doing? Is really weighing on a lot of people. How are you thinking about AI in this moment in your own life?
I'll answer this in a sort of roundabout way. There's this parable that I love that I write about in the book called The Parable of the Chinese Farmer. And some of you may have heard it before. It basically goes like this. There's this farmer in a small village, and his horse runs away. And all of his neighbors come to his door, and they say, "We're so sorry to hear about your horse. It's such a bummer." And the farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." The following day, the horse comes back, and with it, there are 7 other wild horses, another 8 horses that this farmer can look after. And again, the neighbors return to his door, and they say, "You are so lucky. What great fortune. You have all of these horses." And the farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." And the day after that, the farmer's son is riding one of these wild horses and falls off the horse and breaks his leg. And again, the neighbors return, and they say, "What a tragedy. We're so sorry." And the farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." And the day after that, there's generals from the Chinese military who come to this small village to conscript people into the war, to draft people into the army. And because the son has broken his leg, he gets out of the draft. And the neighbors come back to the farmer's door and they say, "What great luck. And this time you can join me." The farmer says, "Maybe yes, maybe no." And that's kind of how I feel about AI. It's like we're in this moment where there's such tribalism. Like you're either sort of team AI, where you think that AI is going to automate all of this rote labor and lead to this age of golden creativity, or you think, oh, we are about to enter civil war and mass layoffs are going to undermine entire industries and there's going to be all of this public unrest. And my view is that we don't quite know yet. And even though there are these CEOs that come out and say, 50% of all entry-level jobs will cease to exist, or, this is how it's going to affect GDP, we as a species are really bad at predicting the future. So there's this professor of mine from college named Phil Tetlock who collated data from all of these experts, politicians, economists, about their predictions about the future, and then he compared them to what actually happened. And his canonical finding was that the average expert was roughly as accurate as a dart-throwing chimpanzee. So that's like one, I think, pretty strong argument for not reading too much into these doomer or utopian predictions.
Can I just check in really fast? Were the chimpanzees good at dart?
Very good question. I think the assumption is no.
Okay, great.
But how to not know? And then the second thing I'll say is that when you have a fixed view of the future, if you think this future is inevitable, it can be incredibly disempowering. And I think one of the things that I love about San Francisco is this sense of optimism and agency and our ability to shape the future or make our little dent in the universe. But if the future is already written, it removes your ability to influence it. And so that's why I try and sort of stay in that I'm not exactly sure how AI is going to play out phase. It might be less gratifying to hear in an interview, but I think the jury is still out. And even though there are all of these predictions about this is what's definitely going to happen, maybe yes, maybe no.
Do you think those predictions are unhelpful or helpful? Because at the beginning of the conversation, you were like, just tell somebody what you think they should do, and then they at least can react to that. Are we reacting to the predictions, or are they making us feel more disempowered?
Well, I think you have to think about the incentives. Like you think about Sam Altman or Dario Amodei, they have raised billions and billions of dollars. It's in their best interest to spin a narrative about how revolutionary and world-changing these technologies will be. And yes, I think there's probably some truth to it. I think we are in this sort of new industrial revolution, and it is going to fundamentally change the way people work. But be careful taking one worldview off of the rack. I think it was Upton Sinclair who said, it's really hard to convince someone of something when their paycheck depends on them not believing it. And I think the converse is true too. It's really hard for AI CEO who is trying to make 10x returns and who has raised, $500 billion in capital, that maybe the technology is not quite as revolutionary as he purports. And so I just try and take everything with a grain of salt. Maybe it's a data point, maybe with more time, more information will present itself. But one of the benefits of not jumping to that conclusion is that I hopefully can stay open to multiple possibilities that may emerge.
And I'm going to get to all of your questions in a second, but how are you making decisions within that framework? So that's the other side of the uncertainty, is how are you choosing what to do with that information?
Well, I don't want to, stick my head into the sand. Like, I am starting to experiment with those tools. I saw this good metaphor in The Atlantic the other day. They said, using AI to solve hard problems is kind of like taking a helicopter to the end of a hike. You might get there faster, but you miss out on part of the reason why the hike was worth doing in the first place. And I feel that way about writing. I love writing. I love the toil and the process of trying to figure out the right word. And so just sort of using AI to be my generative writer is robbing myself of some of the meaning that I might get. And it is this incredible tool. And so one thing that I do, for example, every first draft that I write, I always write it myself. But I have started using AI as an editing partner or as like a sparring buddy. And one thing that I like to think about is, can I use the AI to make my job harder as opposed to easier? So can I ask it to sort of poke holes in my argument or point out some fallacies in sort of the way that I'm structuring a piece? And I think it's really helpful in that context, and it's also a really helpful sort of research buddy, as long as you verify that the studies that it's citing actually exist.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, we have a lot of questions here, so I want to make sure I get to all of them. This is from everybody in the audience, so thank you so much for submitting them. What if that future self meets a decision with regret/resentment? How do you navigate the process of making the decision right despite the resentment?
It's a great question. There's this other author named Daniel Pink, and he wrote this book called The Power of Regret. And the upshot of his argument is that regret can be incredibly instructive. If you make a choice that you realize was the wrong choice, it probably tells you something about what you care about and will help influence the next choice that you make. I think it's inevitable that we all make mistakes. I think especially in like a business context, it's probably maybe overly celebrated in Silicon Valley, sort of like the benefits of failure. But I do think there's wisdom there, because if you are not fearful about getting a choice wrong, you get to stay in the arena. You get to keep playing the game. You get to keep making choices. And I think the fear of getting a choice wrong is what keeps people stuck, is what keeps people paralyzed. And so, there's myriad cliches about, you either get the outcome you want or you get a lesson, or, you can learn through doing, and that's the only way. But I do think there is a silver lining in every sort of realization that you've made a bad choice, which is it helps you learn and grow.
He also found that we far and away regret not taking risks, even if those risks don't pay off, versus taking them. And I think about that often in my life. Like, how lucky are we to be able to take risks and fail at them? Like, how lucky are we to have these regrets? Yeah,
I sort of like risk mitigation framework for making decisions. I also want to couch all of these sort of like tools and tricks as being heuristics and being imperfect. I love this quote, all maps are wrong, but some are useful, And I think any sort of decision-making tool can be useful if it helps illuminate something, but none of these tools are, one size fits all for every single situation.
No, we're here for the Simone Stolzoff Guide to Life. We're all gonna practice it, and we're gonna live great lives as a result of it.
Yeah, so yesterday I was in a bookstore. I was in two bookstores, and one had this book in the self-help section, and the other had this book in the philosophy section. And I think you can choose how you want to treat this book yourself.
Okay, I'm curious to get your thoughts on difficulty of decision making versus quality of decision making. Sometimes it feels like daily life is filled with so many decisions that a mental limit is reached. How does this interface with uncertainty?
Two questions there. I think one of the big cognitive biases, this fallacy that we all carry around, that not too many people know about is called resulting, which is judging the quality of a decision based on the quality of the outcome. And it's really natural to get into this place. I have this mentor named Annie Duke, and she uses this example of the Seattle Seahawks in the Super Bowl. We're on the 1-yard line, and rather than hand it off to Marshawn Lynch, their all-pro running back, they decided to pass the ball, and it got intercepted on the 1-yard line, and they lost the game. And everyone in the sort of Monday morning quarterback, all the pundits on TV, said, "What a stupid decision. How could you possibly throw the ball in that situation?" And it's a classic case of resulting. Because the pass was intercepted, everyone assumed it was a bad decision. But if you actually run the analytics and take all of the factors into account, it actually wasn't a bad decision. It was third down. If they ran the ball in third down, the clock might have been ran out. They didn't have any timeouts left. So the likelihood that that pass was intercepted was like 2%, and sometimes you get a bad break. But we can't necessarily judge the quality of the decision just based on the outcome alone. So I think that's sort of like part one. The second question about decision fatigue, I think, is really apt, especially in this sort of age of abundance that we're in right now. I think a lot of our problems stem from the amount of optionality, the amount of choice that we have. So there's this great study by Barry Schwartz in Paradox of Choice, where he found that in a grocery store that had, say, 30 different options for types of jams to buy, no one actually picked a jam. But when there were like 3 different options, people felt much more comfortable making a choice. And we think sometimes that having all options available to us breeds better decisions or allows us to live a more creative life. But I think we all need some of those constraints. And so that's why you get sort of, Mark Zuckerberg wearing the same t-shirt every day. These like ways that people try to mitigate the number of decisions that they're making so that they free up room in their brain for higher level thinking. I don't know exactly what the science is on that, but I do think we spend too much time agonizing over two-way door decisions, like what to order at the restaurant or, whether to go on vacation to this place or that place, where maybe the difference between the two things are either more comparable than we think, or our ability to course correct if we make a mistake is higher.
So you think one of the secrets to mitigating decision fatigue is just avoiding those two-way door, not treating the two-way door decisions like they're one-way door decisions?
Yeah, or like Annie Duke has this heuristic that she calls the happiness test, where you ask yourself, okay, will this decision matter in 10 days? Will this decision matter in 10 months? Will this decision matter in 10 years? And if the answer is probably no to all 3, you can probably make the decision quicker than you think.
Yeah, the black shirt of it all, I have a pet theory that this is like how we're keeping women down societally, is by making us groom so much that we're decision fatigued before we even get out the door. I can tell.
Liz Moody, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay. The pain of not knowing in political context seems to lead people to bad tendencies, checking out on the one hand or supporting demagogues who falsely promise certainty. If you were advising a political campaign about how to avoid these outcomes, what would you advise?
Me to go back to school for a few more years before I answer this question. I think it's really astute. One data point from the book is that when we are intolerant of uncertainty, we are more likely to believe in misinformation or accept conspiracy theories as true. And I think you can get some political will or political capital in this very uncertain world that we live in if you tell people a really simple story about what the future looks like and how they're going to lead you to the promised land. It's sort of similar to a cult leader. Like there's something really alluring about joining a cult. You can just follow this set of steps and you'll go to heaven, or you'll get personal wealth, or self-actualize. The problem is when you sort of outsource your worldview or your decision-making to a demagogue or a cult leader, you start to lose sight of your own agency, your own ability to think critically and make those sorts of choices for yourself. And so I'm actually somewhat optimistic that we are in this age of extreme polarization and identity politics, and I think that the pendulum is ripe to swing back a little bit toward the center. I think even people that were really far on the right or really far on the left might be cooling a little bit from their hot takes and be willing to find a little bit more common ground. And I think that's one of the things that increasing our uncertainty tolerance allows us to do, rather than assume that you know everything about someone just because of who they voted for in the next election. If you're able to suspend that judgment, maybe you can actually have a conversation and find out. So maybe it's just the optimist in me, but I do believe this age of demagoguery, if that's even a word, is numbered.
I think one thing I take from this question is like, in this room, we're all probably willing to increase, we're excited to increase our tolerance for uncertainty. But how do we sell uncertainty to the masses? Like, how do we make uncertainty as appealing as it possibly can be?
One thing, at least in the political context, is I think we need to rebrand flip-flopping. I think there's this idea that changing your mind is somehow a sign of weakness, when I think the opposite is true. I think leaders who are willing to say, I used to believe this, and then I learned this, and now I believe this, is a sign of strength. And those are the kinds of leaders that I want, at least, to be running my country or company or state. The problem is you need to have some backbone, right? Like you need to stand for some things. No one wants a leader that just sort of throws their hands up. But if we have leaders that are a little bit more intellectually humble, who are willing to open their mind and change their mind, then I think we can go to a better place and find more room in the middle.
Do you know any of these politicians?
I think so. I think Mamdani's actually showed this a few times, and even sort of his positions on Israel or his positions on developers in New York City have changed pretty substantially from how he campaigned. And I'm not sort of like a Mamdani diehard, but I do think he provides a model for being able to change your mind or update your policy positions in a way that gains more credibility and trust as opposed to loses it.
What would you say to an agnostic struggling with uncertainty on the existence? What would you say to an agnostic struggling with the uncertainty on the existence of God?
These small questions, Thanks for the layups.
It's San Francisco. You knew this was going to be a smart audience. You knew what.
Actually, I really like the question because I'm sort of there, right? Like I'm not sure whether God exists, and I can't really write a book on uncertainty without talking to some faith leaders, because I think religions, in some ways, one of their primary functions is to help people cope with the uncertainty of being a human being. And I talked to a rabbi, a pastor, an imam. I talked to various faith leaders. And one sort of common thread with all of them is this idea that practice can be a precursor to belief rather than necessarily something that only comes after you believe. And so I talked to this pastor, and she told me this story about someone who comes to her church and she was an Episcopal minister. And so one of the things in that sort of sect of religion is you recite a creed, which is basically a statement about like how I believe in God. And this person comes and says, I'm not sure if I can be here. I don't think I believe in the creed. And the advice is sort of like, you don't necessarily need to believe in order to state it or to practice. And maybe it's through the practice that will actually help you ultimately believe. And I think, I'm Jewish. I think there's a lot of this in the Jewish tradition, this idea of like wrestling with God. And there's a distinction between what I might call like blind faith, which is just like believing because someone told you so or because you think you should, and a more sort of conscious faith, which is choosing to believe, choosing to put your heart onto something, but staying open to changing your mind and sort of continually wrestling with what are the contours of what it is that I believe. And so to our agnostic wrestler, I'd say you don't necessarily need to come to a definitive conclusion. I think by asking the questions, there is value there. In the words of Rilke, you can live the questions, and ultimately, one day you might live your way into an answer.
And even if you don't, like there's a gift. It's an opportunity that you get to sit in this place of questioning. You get to sit in this place of not knowing. I want your advice. Sometimes we make a decision and quickly realize it's not the right decision, and yet we might stick with it. How can we deal with situations where we realize we've made the wrong choice and do so quickly?
I'll tell you about one study that I quote in the book. It's from this Wharton researcher named Katie Milkman. And she was looking at stock traders. So their job is to sort of pick whether the stock goes up and down. And she looked at particularly people who made wrong predictions and whether they would update their predictions in the following quarter. And she found that these stock pickers sort of broke into two groups. There was a group that was part of the consensus, and they got the decision wrong. And then there was a group that sort of went out on a limb and got the decision wrong. And what she found is people in the first group, who were part of the consensus when lots of people got it wrong, were much more likely to update their predictions in the following quarter than people who went out on a limb. And her explanation is that when we have a sort of out-group opinion, or when we have a prediction that sort of, or a belief that goes out from the norm, we likely tie a larger piece of our identity to that belief. So maybe a classic example is like a flat earther. If you believe that the world is flat, you've likely tied a significant part of your identity to that belief in every sort of Thanksgiving conversation where you've had to defend yourself. And then changing your mind isn't just sort of like changing your mind, it's potentially undermining your identity. It's undermining who you are. And so this is my roundabout way of saying, I think one of the best things that this person can do is try to separate their beliefs from their identity. I think one thing that makes it really hard to change our mind is our psychological need to have sort of coherence, to have a consistent story about who we are, to maintain a positive self-image. And I think one thing that makes changing your mind hard is it might make you have to grapple with the idea that maybe you were wrong in the past.
So going back to your first book, The Good Enough Job, is part of the solution to that a diversification of identity?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think like that's a common thread. One of a good hedge in an uncertain world is to have a diversified identity, to have multiple sources of identity and meaning in your life. It's really interesting. Yesterday I was at a bookstore in DC, and someone was asking me about retirement. And I was like, I'm 35. I'm not qualified to give you retirement advice. But I think it's actually, something that's sort of similar questions of identity, like who am I after I stop working? And it's maybe similar questions to what the 22-year-old who's about to enter the job market, or the 35-year-old who's trying to think about how they might provide for their family. And by diversifying your sources of meaning and identity, it is sort of a hedge against uncertainty or the precarity of the future. Because even if one source of meaning or one source of identity were to crumble, you still have these other pillars that are holding you up.
So to the person who wrote into the question, find ways to divest your identity from your decisions, and then you can say you're wrong quite quickly.
Yeah, like make decisions, but hold them maybe a little bit more lightly.
Okay, on the other side, let's say we have a flat earther in our lives. How do we help? Are we like, take up basketball?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of and see if the basketball bounces to the side. I think, one of the big lessons about helping other people change their minds is you can't. Like you can help find common ground. You can maybe help empathize and make them feel heard into a place where some of their defenses come down. But you can't sort of change someone's mind with force. You have to maybe invite them into drinking the water themselves.
I feel like I've done that a lot, but I do think there's something interesting of like, can I give them other identities to hold on to? Mm-hmm. Would that make them a little bit looser to this identity?
Yeah, just like offer, like, how about boxing?
Yeah.
How about ballet? I mean, maybe, but I think ultimately what's going to help someone change their mind or sort of like see the truth is by coming to a place where they're not sort of defending both their sense of self in addition to their belief. And in order for those walls or those defenses to come down, one of the best things that you can do as a friend is maybe just ask them questions and let them come to some wisdom on their own terms.
You talk about exposing yourself to uncertain situations. Besides writing this book, can you talk about another situation that you've recently exposed yourself to, but like keep it, PG-13?
Yeah. One of the things I hate about being an author is the shameless self-promotion. And, I hate posting on social media. I hate trying to get my friends to come to this event, it's hard. It's sort of like take mercy on my soul, and it feels like it sort of eats at my own idea of not wanting to be an imposition onto others. But in order to promote a book, and ultimately for that book to have an impact, you have to get people to read it. And so one thing that I did in the sort of lead up in the last few weeks is I made a commitment to post a certain number of Instagram reels where I'm just sort of like talking at the camera and like feeling like an idiot. And like, we're in this like one bedroom. I have like my little tripod set up, and like Katie's walking through like, oh, my content creator, And it's like, it's embarrassing, but it's also something that I've grown to accept, and it's sort of like the crazy of this job. It's like the trade-off of being self-employed and being able to do creative work is you have to be your own marketing department. And through putting myself out there a little bit more, it sort of rounded some of the hard edges and the internal judgments of what it means to like be taking a selfie in my living room. And I've actually found there's like some really nice elements of being able to share some of the ideas from the book and connect with people in a direct way. And I think I learned that through exposure.
I also think that makes me think there's something lovely to recognizing when our friends or our loved ones are taking these little uncertain steps and cheering them on. Because, your friends being here or seeing that social media post and saying, good job, you rocked that, I love that, is really meaningful.
Yeah, and I think by putting yourself out there, by having more exposure, you come to appreciate others who are doing the same. Mm-hmm. And so, like when my friend reaches out asking for money for their Kickstarter or asking me to support this cause or whatever, I don't judge them with the same voice that I judge myself. I'm much harder on myself than I am on others. And that can be a helpful tactic, is to create some psychological distance, or to sort of talk to yourself in the third person, or talk to yourself as if you were talking to a friend. That helps trip that inner critic a bit.
And we're all, humans, just trying to have our first human experience on this planet, depending on what you
on Instagram.
On Instagram in front of everybody else. Can you talk about how new managers/employers should manage uncertainty with their teams? Can you talk about how managers/employers should manage uncertainty with their teams? What about parents to children, teachers to students? Let's start with managers to employers.
I think one thing managers could do a better job of, here I'm generalizing, but one thing that I appreciate from managers that I've had in the past is when they show their own vulnerability. So in one of the chapters of the book, I profile Brian Chesky, and the CEO of Airbnb, and how he handled the beginning of the pandemic. So he's leading this huge company. It's fated to have this gigantic IPO at the end of 2019. He's raised all this money, everything's going great, and then global travel shuts down for his global travel company. And, Chesky could not tell his employees exactly when the airports are going to open back up or exactly what the future of the business was going to be. But the first thing that he did was he wrote down a series of principles that he wanted to adhere to through the crisis. He said, I don't want to be a villain. I want to keep all stakeholders in mind. I want to win the next travel season. I want to see this as an opportunity. And those principles became sort of the steady boulders in his life amid all the changing winds. The second thing he did is he brought more certainty to the process. So he couldn't necessarily control outcomes, but for example, he used to have all hands meetings once every 2 weeks, and he made them once a week. And he used to have leadership meetings once a week, and he made them every day. And I think communicating at a regular cadence can be helpful for your employees, even if you don't necessarily have an update to share. It keeps their mind from sort of filling in the negative space with their catastrophizing thoughts. You can sort of create a scaffolding to sort of share what you know and to air out some of their feelings. And then at the end of the day, you have to be willing to share that you're making a bet. You are running an experiment. You don't necessarily have the clairvoyance to know exactly how each choice will work out, but you can validate your employees' feelings and hopefully be alongside them as they gain some clarity through the fog. There's this metaphor that I really liked at IDEO, which was being a leader is sort of like sitting in a rowboat, maybe with your team, on a lake that's shrouded in heavy fog. You might not be able to see very far in front of you or know exactly where you'll end up, but you have two jobs. The first is to maintain faith that you'll eventually reach land. Remember, you're in a lake. And then the second is to keep rowing. And I think that's one of the best things that leaders can do, is to keep rowing, and through the action, hopefully clarity begins to emerge.
What about for teachers to students?
I am not qualified to answer that question, and I think
Katie
it's probably good for me to model some intellectual humility myself.
What about parents to children?
Yeah, I mean, I have 1 year of experience, and so...
and a lot of being a child.
It's true, yeah. I mean, I think... at least a few years, and the parents are in this room. So. One thing that I have learned relatively recently is from this woman named Dr. Becky. You might be familiar with her work. And one thing that she says is that the most important part is the repair. So as a parent, you don't necessarily need to get everything right. There can be times where you act in a way that you wish you hadn't. You raise your voice, you are short-tempered, you're on your phone, you lose your patience. But the more important thing than the act itself is your ability to have a conversation with your kid and be honest about the fact that you messed up. And I think that's a great sort of modeling behavior that I hope to model with Luca as he gets older.
Okay, my last question for you. If you could wave a magic wand for all of us tonight, and you could remove one thought that's in our brains about uncertainty, and you could implant one thought into our brains about uncertainty, what would those two thoughts be?
I think the thought that I would remove is the idea that uncertainty is necessarily threatening. I think biologically this is how we're wired. If you can imagine an ancestor of ours in the jungle and there's a noise in the bushes, if they don't know the source of that noise, it could potentially be lethal. And so our brains, our biology, is set to treat uncertainty as a threat, as a source of fear. But in the book I write that uncertainty can also be the birthplace of possibility. And that's sort of why I think the book is actually optimistic, even though the times that we live in are uncertain and potentially dark. It's that if you are willing to also see uncertainty as the precursor to learning, the precursor to growth, the precursor to finding out the opportunity that sits on the other side of your discomfort, then you can keep rowing. And so that's my wish for you all today, that in spite of all this fog, you keep rowing the boat.
This is Simone Stolzoff. You can get a copy of his book here tonight or at your local bookstore.
And let's also give a hand to Liz Moody for this awesome conversation. It's honestly it's so meaningful for me to be in this room with you all. I've sat in the audience of the Commonwealth Club for maybe a dozen talks in my life, and this is my hometown, and I have my best childhood friend and my best adult friend and my brother, and they're all sitting next to each other in the front row, and my parents, and they're strangers that got roped into this because their coworker told them to come. And so just really from the bottom of my heart, this book has been in existence for 2 days, and there's my son in the back.
Aww.
And thank you all for being here. And thanks to Liz.
Yeah, thank you so much. And also for more information about the Commonwealth Club World Affairs membership and upcoming programs, please visit www.commonwealthclub.org. This is Simone Stolzoff. I'm Liz Moody. Thank you guys all so much for coming out tonight.
Thank you.